So, welcome to my, I guess this is my second talk I gave. The first one was the Faith and Reason talk, which was the first one a few weeks ago. And this one is a talk called A Case for Courage by me. So this is, I had the idea for the talk because, well, recently I feel like I've been more inclined into, I guess, the virtuous life, right? I guess as a probably a fresher and a few years ago, I probably hadn't that mindset because I think I recall actually being in one of the focus Bible studies and they were I think the missionary was like, oh, I hope you guys all become saints, right? And I was like, that's not going to happen. I was like, that's quite a high standard to set, right? And I was like, that doesn't seem likely. Like I wrote it off quite honestly. And I don't know why. It could have been just that it seemed like such a high standard, or that this virtuous life, wasn't for me. It was sort of, it was just sort of, because I think sometimes there are connotations with being virtuous. Some classic ones are, being a bit boring or not having enough fun, that sort of thing. But recently, I guess, as time goes on and you're persistent with your faith, I've become more aware that actually living virtuously is something which is very fulfilling, and I don't think it means you have less fun. I think in some cases it actually means you have more fun. So yeah, and then recently, with this in mind, sort of been reflecting on my own actions. And have realized that courage seems to be at the heart of all of this. Whenever there's a moment for me where I feel a bit uncomfortable or I don't want to do something, instantly there's like a trigger. It's like, come on, Toby, have the courage. You have to think about who you want to be. And it's this idea of, who do you want to be? The person who, this is uncomfortable for them, so they might not take this course of action. Well, you don't really want to be that sort of person. You want to be the person who, it doesn't matter if it's difficult, they just get on with it. So that's sort of the motivation, I think, for courage. And I just wanted to highlight it as a virtue that hopefully we'll all instill. So without further ado, let's get going. So I wanted to start with what is courage in its most basic sort of etymological sense. The definition of courage is the choice and willingness to do something that frightens oneself. Okay. And the ability to confront anger, pain, danger, uncertainty, or intimidation. So this idea that something is, as I sort of just mentioned, something is inconvenient for me, or maybe it makes you feel a bit awkward and you feel like you ought to do this task. So, but, something's getting in the way. So these things are at the bottom. And so you need to have the courage. Courage is that ability to overcome that fear and will yourself to do what you must. If we look at the word from a more etymological sense, it takes me back to the Sacré-Cœur Basilica in Paris. I was fortunate enough on my year abroad to live only about 10 minutes away from this amazing church. And as you can see, the word Sacré-Cœur means sacred heart in French, and cœur being French for heart, which harks back to the Latin of cor, which is Latin for heart. So when we think of courage, we think of the heart and something of the heart. Okay. But what about the heart are we supposed to do to show this idea of courage? Okay, so to help us think of how we will use courage is to help us think of how to see courage, we will use its age-old companion of the depiction of the lion. Now you're probably aware of this, you see it in pop culture. Just think to that of Disney's Lion King or The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Narnia. Lions are always depicted as being very brave. But this isn't just a new idea brought about from the minds of Disney. No, it's an interesting idea and link that stretches far back to places such as the Bible. And, just think of 2 Samuel from the Old Testament, where it said, a valiant man whose heart is like the heart of a lion, or King Richard's nickname of Lionheart for courage and valor in battle. And this comes from observations in nature, understandably, where it's said that lions are the least afraid of anything of all the predators, right? And so, you can imagine this. Just think of them taking on, the much larger buffalo. They're sort of this fearless animal instinctively. And so understanding this bravery is key to courage, okay? Because this is a prime element of courage, and it sheds light now on this the overwhelming irony that ensues in The Wizard of Oz, right? When we see the lion who lacks a heart and thus lacks courage. Okay. So now we know its roots and typically metaphoric representations. What is courage thought of in today's society? Well, today, you could argue that courage is seen as leadership, right? As facing life-threatening danger or following your gut. Okay, and just think to pop culture, right? Think to films such as, Harry Potter or Star Wars or any superhero film, really. They're peppered throughout society. And in all these examples, the main characters are often leaders of a group, fighting against incredibly powerful evil, and having to take countless risks along the way. But then, as the audience, you come to think, well, when in your day-to-day life do you face life-threatening danger, right? Let alone lead a group of people into it. Sometimes you won't want to or need to be the leader of a group. And sometimes taking risks isn't really always necessary. This in turn offers really only, I think, a small slice as to what courage is. And I think it can cause a lot of people to neglect the virtue altogether, as they simply don't see it relevant to their day-to-day lives. So why do we need it in our day-to-day lives? And why does it warrant a re-evaluation of what authentic courage is? The church often teaches values which can be confusing at times and counterintuitive, right? So, for example, think about how we assert and propagate our faith with non-violence, right? How are we supposed to love our enemies? And why should we turn the other cheek? In a lot of ways, these can seem quite beguiling to our rational minds, okay? And with this behavior taught, and rightly so, by the church, it can, however, lead to distortions in what kind of people Christians are. So thus, sometimes Christians can be perceived of as being weak, okay? Sort of, think back to this non-violence, right? Because we adhere to this principle, some people see this as being passive, not fighting back, with violence. Meek, perhaps, because we do instill the virtues of kindness and consideration. Sometimes people think we're being submissive. We're sort of not sticking up for what we believe in because we're afraid of, what others will think. And lastly, emotion-led. I mean, you can see this in the faith and reason talk I gave before, right? People think that we go more for emotion and not this rational mind because, as I said before, sometimes you have to let go to some degree of this aggressive rationalism, but that doesn't by any means mean we're emotion-led. And yeah, although there's truth in here, it must not be taken to be the only representation of Christians. And moreover, we shouldn't let society shape what sort of Christians you are and want to be. Okay. So how do we go about changing this? Well, I think it's through the understanding and implementation of authentic courage. Okay. And C.S. Lewis gives a definition of courage, which I particularly like. He says that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. Okay, so in other words, it is displaying all the other virtues when it is hardest to do so. Okay, so when it's the most real, think about times at which it's hard to be patient when your patience has been tested so greatly, right? Think about times where you have to be honest, but it's hard because you fear persecution, okay? Think about times where you have to be resilient, you have to be strong, the virtue of fortitude, when everything else is sort of against you, okay? He argues that expressing these virtues when it's convenient to us is not really showing this virtue of courage, okay? Because it's at that hardest point, it's the turning point from when we decide to be virtuous. Now, I think this all has to do with this idea of living in alignment, okay, with what you believe, being a person you hope to become. As Catholics, we often speak of integrity, okay, this desire to be in alignment with ourselves and to act in accordance with our will, okay. And on this topic, John Paul II has some valuable insight. So St. John Paul II, Carl Wojtyła, was, other than the Pope, obviously, he was a great moral philosopher, okay? This was his area of expertise, you could say. And he said in his writings that every time we perform a moral act, we act in virtue, we do two things, okay? We affect the world in a particular way. You know, think about how, you know, we do this, we make a sandwich, we've affected the world, we, you know, we move in this direction, that sort of thing. We're affecting the world, right, in a physical sense. But in a deeper way, we are creating the person we are becoming. Okay, so that's quite a profound statement. So let's unpick that a little bit. He goes on and says, you can think of every moral act as a little brick in the wall. Okay. And with each one of those acts, you're building up the edifice of your character, right? I am becoming integral, whole, one with my belief. And as we've said, this wall is built on acts of virtue, okay? So you can think of each brick as the act of virtue and this whole wall being your integral self, okay? And much like that, and much like the cement that holds these bricks together, courage is what I think builds and what maintains this wall, right? The wall of the self and your integrity. So you think about this in more detail. It takes a certain amount of courage to do a virtuous act to begin with, especially in times of difficulty at that testing point, okay? That takes great courage, doing something when it's inconvenient to you. But what's more is there's this idea of maintenance, okay? So it builds and maintains this wall, because if you choose to do a virtuous act, sometimes it also takes a lot of courage to stand by that in the long term, right? Maintain that element. If you were really honest today, but then tomorrow, you know, the circumstances provided meant that, you know, you lend yourself to be dishonest and you are, then your wall's been broken down. The virtuous act of being honest the day before is sort of now in conflict with your dishonesty about the same thing, okay? So you need courage both to build this wall, and also to maintain it. Okay. So it's this idea of continuing to stand up for what you believe in. Okay, maintaining your values in the long run. Okay, if that's the virtues themselves, or if it's your faith. And it's worth noting here that sometimes sticking up for your values can be resistant to others. Okay. So what I want to do now is take a look at the Gospel of Matthew to help us fully understand this balance between resistance but not violence. Okay. Because I think sometimes there's this, sometimes going too hard into courage can cause quite a lot of resistance, as it should, but we never want to be violent. We want to maintain this idea of non-violence. So let's take a look at Matthew 5:38 to 41. So giving voice to the general consensus of law-abiding Jews, Jesus says, "You have heard it said, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well." Okay. So that's often quite a confusing and strange message to a lot of people, right? Sort of, if someone hits you, why would you then offer them the other cheek, right? That seems kind of counterintuitive. But although this can sound like passivity in the face of evil, it's not. It's the proposal of a new and very effective means of resistance. Okay. So classically, there are two responses to violence: fight or flight, right? We can respond with counter-violence, we can fight, or we can flee, we can just run away. Okay, we can acquiesce. The flight aspect. But neither of those two options end well in the long run, really. If you fight violence with violence, it often makes the situation much worse. Think of like a bar fight or something. If you retaliate, often you both end up in jail. It's not, there doesn't seem to be that justice there. And if you flee, if you acquiesce, you confirm the violent person in their evil and their tyranny. Okay, you're saying, I conform to whatever world you choose to believe in. But what Jesus proposes here is a third way. Okay, and look at his example. If someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn and give them the other. Again, it sounds like passivity, but look, in Jesus's time, you would never have used your left hand, right? It was considered unclean. So if someone strikes you on the right cheek, that means that they're striking you with the back of their hand. Okay, that means they're striking you with their right hand and the back of it. So this was a gesture of contempt, right? It was the way they would treat a slave or an inferior. Okay, so what's Jesus saying here? He's saying, if someone treats you that way, don't fight back, but by God, don't flee either, right? Rather, stand your ground and turn the other cheek. Okay, you're saying, in effect, you will not treat me that way again. Okay, I refuse to cooperate with the world you're living in. You're mirroring back to the violent person their own violence, hoping to thereby lure them into a different moral and spiritual space. Now, obviously, at this point, you might think this is easier said than done. So let me give you some more contemporary examples of this teaching in action in hope to inspire you. So the first is from Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. Okay. when he was a young priest in Johannesburg, he was making his way one day along a raised wooden platform, essentially a pavement, over this muddy road. And he came to a narrow point in the platform and was met by a white man who was a racist. And the white man said, "Get off the pavement. I don't make way for gorillas." Okay. And Tutu, he got off the pavement, gestured broadly and said, "I do." Okay. And the second example of this concerns Mother Teresa of Calcutta. So in Calcutta, one day she was holding a starving child by the hand and took her to a bakery and begged her for a loaf of bread for this child. The baker at that point spat full in Mother Teresa's face. But the saint stood her ground. She smiled and said, "Thank you for that gift for me. Perhaps now something for the child." Okay. So this is the bravery in courage that we long to hold. Okay. In both these situations, Tutu and Mother Teresa, they didn't fight back, but by God, they didn't flee either. That's the easy option, right? If you're faced with aggression, you run away or you fight back, but they didn't. Rather, they stood their ground, and in this humorous and quite provocative way, they mirrored back the violence to their aggressors, hoping to thereby lure them into a different moral and spiritual space. Okay. So hopefully we have a better understanding of what authentic courage it looks like. It's being resistant for what you believe in, but not aggressive. It's that moment of taking action when circumstance is not convenient to you. And it's that test to your integrity, which, believe it or not, you do face day to day. So I began this talk by mentioning that once you begin to see your acts every day as either passive or active, okay, so you have to discern whether your act is of moral significance. Okay, if I decide to make a sandwich and I'm trying to decide what to put inside it, that's not really a moral decision. Okay, that's just sort of a typical, just a passive choice, and doesn't really have any significance on my character. Whereas an active choice is one which will either build my character, my integrity, or it will knock it down, perhaps. And these are often easier to spot because they often require this courage that we're talking about. Okay, so often you might feel awkward, or you might feel scared. And to me, I've come to recognize these feelings now as signs for me to be courageous. Okay. So it's at this point you really start to see where your values lie and what length you'll go to stand up for them, and what sort of person you are to become. Okay. So lastly, on a more pragmatic end to my talk, I want to leave you with a sort of challenge. Okay. It sometimes is difficult in our lives to recognize those times. I just sort of mentioned times where we can practice courage. When we do act with a moral aim. And so it's always worth reflecting upon regularly. Okay. A great exemplar of this actually is American founding father Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was quite keenly aware of the role virtues had in our lives, and rightly saw them as the key to a good life well lived, which bodes well for a founding father of America. I think we all hope that our leaders will be aware of their moral and virtuous compass. So every night before he went to bed, he carried with him this virtue checklist. Okay, so here we are. And as you can see, you can sort of ignore the title of temperance. I think he had these on each day. For each week, he had a different title. But as you can see at the top, you have obviously the days of the week. And then on the side here are what he describes to be the 13 virtues. It's a good point to note that when we speak of virtues, often there's quite a broad range of what people think virtues are. Okay, so the church hold two different groups of virtues, cardinal virtues, and some other ones. I forget the name of those, but there's a whole branch of philosophy about virtue ethics, and so you get people like Plato who also talk about a various spectrum of virtues. So sometimes it can be difficult to ascribe to a set list. I find sometimes with myself that the church virtues are often, I think there's maybe 7. And sometimes I find it a bit harder to distinguish the differences between them all, because often, and quite rightly so, they interlock. They are sort of quite integrated. Faith, hope, and love all have quite overlapping themes sometimes. And so sometimes it's worth looking at the extended set of virtues, like here we have 13. But I doubt you'll find a set of virtues which are not to be ascribed to, you could say. So I don't think any of them are going to teach something which isn't a good trait to practice. Okay, so don't feel like you have to get it, a correct list. I think most virtues will do where you find them. You often hear of the 7 deadly sins and 7 virtues. They're good. You can look at Plato, also very good. So really just pick some, and I'd say have a go. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson, so he used to look at this before bed, and he used it to reflectively think about his day, and if he had practiced any of the virtues listed on the side. He believed that tracking them could help him to become more aware of them in his daily life and thus exercise more virtuous behavior. So I challenge you to create your own checklist. I think you can even print this one off from the internet if you want. But create your own checklist and just mark which virtues you did or didn't exercise in that day. It's always a good practice. I think self-reflection, I've come to learn more and more, is a good thing. You can incorporate this into a prayer if you would like as well. There's I think the daily examine is a form of prayer which incorporates this idea of reflection and about how you've acted in accordance with God and how you recognize grace and that sort of thing. So I think it's always a good practice to do something like this before bed. And of course, we're not expecting you to get all in this case, all 13 every day. I think that would seem, there's just not that many decisions potentially in the day. So don't feel too bad if you only do a few a day. But it's just good, I think, to keep track of them, because not only does it hold you accountable to yourself and to God, but it also makes you more aware of the opportunities that you have in day-to-day life. And if you think you might not have the follow through to do this, I would invite someone to hold you accountable. So that could be a friend, family member, or whomever, really. So yes, so that's my talk, and hopefully I'll just go over again, what we believe authentic courage to be. Okay, so it's being resistant for what you believe in, but not aggressive. Okay, it's that moment of taking action when circumstance is not convenient to you. And lastly, it's that test to your integrity, that wall of integrity you've built with your moral acts, which, believe it or not, you do face day to day. And then you really get to see where your values lie and what length you'll go to see what sort of person you are to become. So thank you for listening. And it would be great. It'd be really nice if anyone had any thoughts. I'm always up for a discussion. So there you are.